to invite Arsen Kharatyan. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of IQ Media, and I'll just remind everybody to, you don't have to read all of your remarks, but to try to keep them brief enough so we can have a chance to hear from everybody and perhaps even have questions from the commissioners and other members on the dais. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I want to thank Chairman Wiese and Helsinki Commission for organizing this and important hearing, and I want to thank, of course, the members of the Armenian Caucus, whom I know for over a decade myself. Thank you very much once again for putting Armenia and our democratic process on in Washington and in the agenda. Briefly about myself, I grew up in Armenia and got engaged in civic activism as a young student at a young age. In 2008, after the disputed presidential elections that saw then President Serge Sarkisyan come to power, many of us were arrested, including the current prime minister and many in the political elite currently in power, harassed to an extent that we, and personally I myself, was forced to leave the country. But it wasn't all that bad. I found my wife, Miss Sonia Sharigian here, who was born across the river in Virginia, and who currently works for the US government and has been working for over the last decade, whose job took us to Georgia, the country of Georgia, which is also getting quite a lot of support from the US, which I believe is a very important thing to do. I myself worked at Voice of America and had the opportunity to interview many of you, including Congressman Pallone here and Congresswoman Jackie Spear many times, especially when it came to discussions on the Armenian Genocide Resolution. And I remember one of these halls where my journalist colleagues are now here. We were discussing the resolution in 2009 at the Foreign Relations Committee, which was quite a tough vote. It took 8 hours, and there were parliamentarians back then from Turkey, from Armenia, including the current ambassador to the United States, who was DCM back then, Mr. Varujan Nersisyan, who I want to thank for being here with us. Anyways, I will shortly talk a little bit about the revolution that we went through. This was by large a revolution of values. This was by large a revolution and aspiration for a democratic state that our country and our nation has been struggling for a long time. This was a homegrown revolution, obviously. This was an internal process by large, but this would not have been possible without the great support that the Armenian civil society and media has been receiving from the United States as well. For a number of years, this country has been supporting democratic institutions in our country, including my great colleague, Miriam Lanskoy, who will be speaking here through the National Endowment for Democracy, which has been supporting many of the young civil society groups, including the media organizations, for many years, for which I want to thank, and I want to see the continuation of that. So for the last 3 decades, our nation experienced great challenges, from military conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, which of course, congressmen and congresswomen here know very well, to massive economic decline, transition from the Soviet centralized to market economy with a continued blockade of our 2 borders by our 2 neighbors in the east and in the west. Since our independence in 1991, our people never stopped their struggle for their fundamental freedom, civil and electoral rights. We do realize that the path to freedom is not an easy one. It is a bumpy road, but in our view, Armenia and the Armenian people have no other choice but to have a country with fully functioning democratic state institutions and a strong civil society. While Armenia's nonviolent Velvet Revolution is yet another example of great positive transformation and a hope for democracy for the world at this time of crisis, I have to admit that there is a great deal of challenges that we have to deal with. The new democratically elected administration of our country, headed by the leader of our revolution and currently the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, has introduced its reform agenda with big emphasis to fight against corruption, building state institutions, ensuring fundamental freedoms and liberties of our citizens. While the current civic contract ruling party, or the fraction called My Step, which is represented by my great friend Hamazas Danelian here, received a very high vote of confidence, over 70%. In December of 2018, the new administration in Yerevan is now dealing with fundamental changes in the state governance in order to ensure the prosperity for its citizens and security for the state. Years of corrupt governance eroded the state apparatus, created an oligarchic and a kleptocratic system where all of the resources of the country were utilized to benefit a tiny minority of strongmen and criminals. To change an almost failed state to a functioning system of governance is not an easy task, and we expect the United States to stand by the Armenian people as it has done since our independence. Since early 1990s, the American people supported Armenia in its path to democracy, market economy, and helped build a strong civil society, as I mentioned before. I would like to note that this continued support has been instrumental in our success before, during, and hopefully after this Velvet Revolution. Since its inception, the democratically elected parliament and the government of Armenia have announced a wide range of reforms. A fight against corruption, and I can state that at this point, systemic corruption in the country is practically eliminated. And that said, the Prime Minister and the government, no one in the ruling party has been or can be spotted for being involved in anything related to corruption so far. As the political elite which came to power as a result of the revolution through free and fair elections is a group of young and educated idealists who are true believers of fundamental human rights and have the best intentions to make their country a fully functioning democracy. However, it is evident that good intentions are not enough for changes of this scale, so we do need your assistance at this critical time. The government of Armenia has announced its policy of fighting against corruption, which will soon be adopted by the country's parliament. The policy includes a wide range of changes in the area of judiciary, tax and customs, reforming police and public security system, as well as education, healthcare, and social security. The United States can and has already shown interest in supporting the Armenian government in all of these areas. However, it would be a great sign of support from Washington if this interest translated into concrete actions. While with the great help of the Friends of Armenian Caucus at the US Congress, the financial aid to Armenia has doubled for the next year, earmarking the funds allocated to our country like it is done with our neighbors Georgia and Ukraine would be a great sign of wider political support. Meanwhile, in my view, from aid to trade should be the philosophy of Washington, D.C. with regards to Armenia. Hence, making Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the OPIC funds, larger, like it is again in case of Georgia and Ukraine, would encourage American businesses to enter Armenian market with more interest and confidence. Last but not least, supporting Armenia in the area of security can and should be discussed further. Our military is present in Afghanistan and Iraq within the framework of NATO's Partnership for Peace program. Considering the unresolved conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh and the changing security architecture of our region, continued and deeper training of our security forces is of crucial importance. So this is an area where US support would be greatly appreciated. That said, you should also raise your expectations of what Armenia and the Armenian people can and should do in the months and years ahead. You should not explain or excuse away our failures because of geopolitics or the legacies of the past. Yes, Armenia's challenges are decades in making, but just like the people's apathy and seemingly all-powerful political monolith, the challenges can be overcome and resolved. Much is at stake, and we have got to get this right. The people who believed in themselves and the strength of the universal ideals of freedom, fairness, and pursuit of happiness deserve it all. I once again thank this Commission for organizing this important hearing and will be happy to address your questions.